Welcome back to The State of Work, the podcast by Lano, where we hear from business leaders and innovators, as well as freelancers and remote employees, exploring topics to do with the benefits, limitations, and solutions around remote and flexible work all around the globe. I'm your host, Maddie Duke, and today I'm speaking with Pau Sabria, co-founder of Remotely Works, a software development talent marketplace that helps US-based software companies build and manage great remote teams quickly by connecting them to top developers in Latin America. Prior to founding Remotely Works, Pau and the co-founding team built a 130-person multidiscipline team in Latin America with their previous venture Olapic, which was acquired by Monotype in 2016. I spoke to Pau about the talent shortage faced by US tech companies and the solutions that Remotely Works provides to companies and remote software developers alike. Welcome to the State of Work, Pau. It's so great to be speaking with you today.
Thank you for having me.
First, before we kick off, where are you joining from today?
I live in Brooklyn, New York, in the US.
Nice. Yeah, very hip.
Very much so.
Yeah, before we get into the nitty-gritty, it would be really great if you could give us an overview of, first of all, yourself, but also Remotely Works. Would be great to hear in your words, a bit of an introduction.
Sounds good. So my name is Pau. I'm originally from Barcelona. I studied electrical engineering and then went into management consulting, and then moved into the US in 2008 to study an MBA program. And there, during that MBA program, I met my co-founders of Olapic, which was a marketing technology software company.
Yeah.
And we grew that between 2010 and 2016 when we were acquired. And after that acquisition, we stayed at the company, at the parent company, for 3 more years, and then went on to pursue new opportunities. One of those opportunities, the latest opportunity, is Remotely Works, which is a marketplace where we connect great job opportunities from VC-backed US-based software startups with great engineering software development talent in Latin America specifically.
Okay, awesome. So I'd love to hear obviously you're based in the US, so there's a bit of a geography focus there in terms of why US-backed startups and why Latin America. But what is it about Latin America that suits this business model of pairing US-backed startups with talent in Latin America?
So the reason why our offering is appealing to US VC-backed startups is the ever-growing talent crunch that software companies are suffering. Mm-hmm. It is estimated that worldwide there's an imbalance of 6x between supply and demand of software technical positions. And this is something that has been the case for the good part of the last decade, mm-hmm. And is obviously responsible for some of the inflation of salaries that we've seen, very pronounced in the US, of course, in the main tech hubs, and those would be Silicon Valley, Seattle, Boston, New York. But obviously, it's also starting to happen in secondary cities in the US, and it has permeated internationally as well. Most notably, I think that Tel Aviv in Israel was the first one to also suffer from that. But now you start to see, I have a lot of friends from college in the industry, and no matter where they live, they complain about the same shortage of talent. And yep. So we obviously think that pain is particularly heightened in the US, and therefore, from a demand perspective, our marketplace focus where that pain is the biggest. And why we focus then in servicing that demand from Latin America is mostly time zone. Mm-hmm. We've learned that for the broad majority of that demand, time zone is something that is important. There's obviously exceptions to that. There's different degrees of maturity of engineering organizations, and some of them are structured in a way in which they want around-the-clock development, and they have the processes to be able to do that. But for the most part, especially in early stage when a lot of iterative, a lot of conversation needs to happen, similar time zone is a must. And therefore, for the US, obviously, that means staying within the American continent. And so we've focused mostly in Latin America. We've also dabbled into Canada, but Canada, of all of the non-US markets, is the one that is also starting to experience a lot of shortage of talent for obvious reasons, because they speak English, and it's the most natural kind of neighboring place to go hunt for developers for companies.
Yeah. Okay. And is there a reason you're focusing on remote hiring rather than relocation?
Yeah, this is something that we in our past company at Olapic, it's how we implemented our strategy. Relocation is not necessarily super easy, and in part is also due to the limits of the immigration system in the US. There are a lot of restrictions and quotas in terms of visas that make that be like an extremely uncertain way of running a company. And uncertainty, like startups are already very uncertain. You don't want to add more uncertainty to them. And so the plan was, at least for us, was always to establish remote engineering hubs that would be proud to work and be treated as first-class citizens by the core HQ in the US, but at the same time give them a purpose and a willingness to stay in their country of origin, because it helps the local development, because it allows them to also live a life close to their families, and because it can work. Companies can make it work in a way that it benefits all parties. And then on a second aspect, obviously, is that there is a protective element to it, which obviously if you move people into the US, then they are all, again, subject to the same dynamics of the talent markets in the US, and the likelihood is that they will get poached by Google, by Facebook, Uber, whoever bids the highest at that point. So that's why we decided to focus on that structure.
And is there a big push from candidates to be working remotely?
Yeah, and this has been particularly true after the coronavirus pandemic, where a lot of people realized that they were able to kind of do this type of job anywhere, from anywhere, and particularly the engineering organizations realized that was actually that nothing broke.
Yeah.
And so that a lot of those assumptions that they had as to they have to be working in the same office on the same roof don't necessarily hold the test of that pandemic. And so for the most part, we have developers that do want to stay where they are from or where they currently live. It is also true that there are developers that, for whatever personal circumstances, want to move to other countries and want to relocate and want to do that type of jump, and potentially remotely is a stepping stone towards making that dream like a reality. But for the most part, it is something that is significantly more complex and not part of our core value proposition. As I said, having a company sponsor a visa with the uncertainty and the time schedule of what that means can take a significant amount of time. What we've seen mostly from Latin America, because of its ties to Europe, we have seen people being able to secure citizenships from a European country and then make the jump it's much more common to make the jump into Europe than into the US in our experience.
Okay, yeah. And how do you approach compliance and employment law in this case then? I mean, of course, some startups prefer to work with contractors or freelancers, even in this field. But when it comes to employment and employing people remotely, do you help your clients on the startup side facilitate that process as well?
We have a view in which there is the world of compliance is essentially a world of risk mitigation, and so I think it's really hard to have risk-free employment anywhere, even in the US. Things can happen at any given point, and so the question is, what are the risks that each startup is willing to commit to, or how they plan to make it work, and given what risks they decide to choose, how do they mitigate them? And in our experience, and again, back in Olapic, we had a team of 130 people in Argentina. We were exposed to all sorts of risks. We tried like contractor situations, and we tried full employment with subsidiary situations. And the reality is that no solution is perfect. Far from it, but you need to decide what flavor do you like, and how do you deal with it.
Yeah.
On the contractor situation, obviously you need to be compliant with contractor regulations, both locally and in the US, and therefore there are certain things that you will be able to do or not be able to do. And on the subsidiary / employment situation, you will be subject to local labor laws and the consequences of that. And so, yes. At the end of the day, I think of the entrepreneur figure as someone that needs to decide where do they want to focus their attention and energy, and which risks do they really can kill the startup in their different phases of development. And so what we see is that startup companies tend to like the contractor situation first as they get their bearing, because obviously it has a lower friction and the risk can be managed in a much easier way, and try to provide as good of an experience to the contractor as if they were treated like an employee. Mm-hmm. And the question is, how do you then create processes and put processes in place to enable that distinction between how you treat employees in the US and how do you treat contractors elsewhere. And that's where remotely can help in creating those processes, HR processes, and create that distance that satisfies the risk appetite of the startup, and satisfies the contractor laws in the different geographies where they have developers.
Yeah, okay. So it's mostly that startups are, at least in the beginning, preferring to work with contractors. Do you have any that are like, we want to employ someone, and then you have to, help them decide whether they need to set up an entity or, like use an EOR or something like that?
We haven't pursued that option yet with any of our customers. In part also probably because we're a young company ourselves. We were founded less than a year and a half ago, and we ourselves didn't place our first engineer until about a year ago, and so it's still early to see how things evolve. And if I were to draw a parallelism, probably our experience with our own company in the past was a good example of that. We started with contractors wiring money through Western Union, like that type of kind of setup, which was very, very, very cumbersome and to some degree risky. The reality was that eventually that we learned how are the things, or how we should have done the things, what type of legal agreements we should have in place, what types of processes we should have in place to kind of minimize that. Eventually at Olapic, we did create the subsidiary, and we did create the full employment type of figure, and we did it on our own. It's also true that we didn't even know there were such a thing as employment of record back then, even though in the US, obviously, is a very common practice to have it, just to be able to secure health insurance at an affordable price. And we did implement that in the US. We didn't know that existed outside the US. Mm-hmm. And so we did it ourselves. And certainly it's a pain, like setting up your own subsidiary takes forever. You need to notarize, translate, put the Hague apostille. It's not an easy process.
Yeah.
And that leads into a lot of companies essentially not committing until they are very, very, very sure that this is something they want to do.
And also, you'd want there to be a talent pool there that's significant enough to kind of warrant this effort that goes into that side. It certainly seems to make sense if you're employing, say, 100 people in one country or one part of the world, but if you're hiring one somewhere and one somewhere else, you'd certainly be looking for other solutions.
Exactly.
Build and grow your global team with Lano. Companies that want to hire talent in a country where they don't have a business presence or legal entity can use Lano's all-in-one platform to compliantly hire remote full-time employees or freelance talent in over 150 countries. Find out more at lano.io. Drawing from your experience both with Remotely Works as well as your experience growing and expanding that team at Olapic, do you have any advice for people that are looking to onboard or hire talent from Latin America specifically, but also remotely in general?
Yeah, I think that probably the biggest recommendation, and where we make the most amount of work, it's kind of what we would call the 101 of remote work is, and by remote work, again, I mean US to outside the US, not US like remote within the US. It's just to be extra mindful of the cultural differences. And this is something that can feel a little bit odd, to especially the companies that have operated within the US for the most part. There's no malice. I think it's just, not being aware that the world may be working in different ways in different countries. And that could mean extra work and extra complexity for the HR team. And oftentimes that extra complexity is not necessarily super welcome. But examples for that would be your holiday and vacation policy may need to change. Mostly because, no one in Argentina cares about 4th of July, holiday in the US.
Yeah.
And forcing, while you want to have a team that obviously is, as aligned as possible with those types of perks, something that needs to be taken into account is that those developers also have families and they also have local celebrations that they need to be able to enjoy, unless they want to feel alienated in a way from their own daily personal lives. And so that is one of the things that very quickly gets adjusted and corrected, and people understand and start to be mindful about it. And then obviously from a communications, how you communicate, when you communicate to the team, that obviously there's a cultural aspect too, that spans not only in how you operate as a company, but also how you interview people. There are cultural gaps in what is expected from a candidate, what is expected behavior and qualitative aspects that in the US may be very strong and may be very kind of common sense or almost like muscle memory, that then when you go outside the US, that's not how people do it. For instance, a good example of that is it is expected in the US to have an innate sense of curiosity, question the company, come very prepared with really good questions, as incisive as possible, almost like to show that you don't really want to join and you have to kind of convince me to join.
Yeah.
And that's good, expected, strong behavior in a candidate. Whereas in other places, in Argentina, in other places in Latin America, that's not necessarily the case. That may come across as rude or like someone that is not engaged actually in joining the company. And so what we see oftentimes is hiring managers that are disappointed because a strong candidate technically didn't seem to show interest because they didn't have very good questions or didn't have, were not like thinking hard about the opportunity, right? Whereas the other one was trying to be respectful.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a really, really great distinction to make, because particularly at that point, people talk a lot about cultural differences when you're working with a team that's split between different locations and different cultures. And that can also obviously happen with co-located workplaces, because the world is a very, multicultural place. But in that onboarding and interviewing, when you're still in that recruitment process, being aware of those differences that, at that stage already is also really important, because that'll help you kind of mitigate prejudice in a way, not prejudice maybe, but as you say, that the perceiving one thing as disinterested when it's intended to be polite or respectful. That's a really great point.
And similarly, I think that this is not just an effort that needs to be made on the side of the company, correct? So part of the work that we do at Remotely is we have training programs and learning experiences that help and prepare the developer to know what to expect, to what the ideal behavior would be. What are those norms? And I think that it has to be met in the middle, in the sense that both the developer needs to be an effort to get closer to what the company, after all, they're trying to get hired, correct? And so it's something that needs to happen on both sides, but certainly it's one of the challenges that we see in these early phases of mostly US-centric companies going abroad.
Mm-hmm. And so does Remotely Works act as a marketplace where there are job listings and how does it actually work in practice? Do you actually play an active role in matching people up, or is it more like a self-managed marketplace?
Correct. So on the demand side, so when we work with our customers, we do a lot of effort in vetting the companies. So we ask questions about the founders. We record why they are working on that problem in the first place. We almost serve as like a VC almost. We question them, their true willingness to do this, because if they don't believe it themselves, then it's going to be hard for them to convince others to join. We look at the finances, we look at the run rate. Are they going to stay in business? What do we think the prospects of the company are? We look at what is exciting, what is the technical challenge, and we start to distill all of those aspects that we think that are important, because we don't want to be wasting anyone's effort in pursuing an opportunity that is not worthwhile. And also because that gives us the type of understanding of what the company looks for and what type of profile is ideal. And so that's phase one. Phase two, we are constantly looking for great talent, and we establish a relationship with that talent, and we distill what are the career aspirations that they have, and we see ourselves less as recruiters and more like talent managers, almost like the talent managers that you would see in one of the agencies in Hollywood. And what we help is like then based on the career progression, the skill set, and the aspiration of the developer, we try to figure out if they have opportunities in those companies that we had vetted before. And when we do the match manually. And so, yes, this is a managed marketplace. There is no such thing as going and seeing a job post and then applying to that job post. In fact, it's rarely the case that we pitch a job post. We generally pitch a company, which is quite unique for the marketplace. The first thing that we show the talent is never a specific role or a specific position. It's more about what the company is, how their engineering organization behaves, what tech stack they have, what are the people, who are the people that are already working there, what are they looking for at the broad level, that type of profile of a company. And it's when they've seen that they feel that that's something that could be interesting to them, then they say, well, I'd be interested in a full stack position here, or like the back end challenge, because they understand better the product, the mission, and the team behind it, and how it operates.
Yeah.
And then we see if we have the position, and then they can drill down into what are the roles and the specifics of that position, the tech challenge of that position, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. Have you seen any trends in terms of what the talent is looking for in a company? I mean, maybe if we put aside the distinction between employee versus contractor, because obviously, contractors don't have the same rights and benefits as an employee. So maybe considering that difference, I guess, is there an overall trend in terms of what people are looking for?
Yeah, for us, mostly we attract developers that work for local companies. So for them, the experience of working for a US company is very, very attractive.
Yeah.
That usually comes with a salary raise, which is pretty expected. And we, of course, have very competitive salaries as a result of our demand coming from the US.
Yeah.
But we also only focus in very senior talent.
Okay.
So in our vetting process for developers, most of the talent that comes to us, generally speaking, is junior and doesn't make the cut into the network.
Okay.
And we talk with every single one that applies. We send an email. We justify why they're not being accepted and read every single reply that they send to us. And oftentimes what we see there is that a lot of people see the opportunity in software development, are trying to build a career in software development, and they struggle to find good opportunities there. And they feel attracted to remotely naturally because of the type of demand that we have. The challenge there, and what I often recommend a junior software developer, is that they should try to find a local company, ideally with good engineering managers, that can groom them in a way into becoming a mid-level and then a senior developer. And that there are a lot of practices that I do believe are better suited for a local employment, kind of desk to desk, sitting one next to each other, and someone overviewing your laptop on top of you, to build those habits and to build those best practices in professional software development. And the idea of doing that remotely is more challenging. And I think that's the reason why a lot of companies are less likely to start hiring abroad by hiring junior people, because grooming someone like in any function really, it's hard to manage someone junior into becoming a good developer or a good employee from abroad.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point as well. I'm just going to apologize for someone's drilling in the apartment above, I think. So apologies for the noise. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting note to think about, because I think when we have these conversations about remote work, we often are talking very broadly, and there's an assumption about a certain level of work experience. You know, we're talking kind of mid to senior level talent. We're talking white collar jobs. We're not even touching on anything else. You know, like, and so to think about junior, someone starting out in their career in a co-located situation, so that they do to think about when someone's actually ready to make that switch, but then also thinking about the more senior people, training and grooming, as you say, those more junior talent, then they have to come into the office, you know, like, or there has to be some kind of compromise where there's enough senior people available in the location where the junior people are kind of starting out, to make that work. I don't know. I don't really have a question for you there. I just think it's a really interesting distinction to make and something to think about.
And I think that as our expectation, again, drawing from our experience at Olapic, is that as our customers start to build larger and larger teams abroad, that then they will have that stepping stone infrastructure in those local countries, that then they will be able to bring more junior people into those organizations and be able to have like proper career progression in those organizations. Yeah. But certainly doesn't feel like that's the landing stepping move for those teams. You need somewhat autonomous talent. On the senior front, though, what we see, especially the ones that are really, really good developers, and that we see an increased appetite for filtering companies beyond the economics of the deal, beyond the salary, the bonuses, the perks, the benefits, even the stock options. What we see is the need for that something else that comes from the product, the mission of the company. Does it have an impact or not? Who are you working with? Like, a lot of those aspects are the things that tend to matter more to developers, senior developers.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And do you see, thinking about further into the future for Remotely Works, do you see yourselves covering any different fields of work or talent, or any different kind of types of companies, maybe those more well-established, you know, not so early stage startups that are, a bit more established, or anything? What's the future?
For the foreseeable future, we'll continue to focus on that segment of companies, on VC-backed startups, and for the most part, still focused in the U.S. What we do expect is that the talent will potentially go more global. So we expect the requirement of similar time zone to fade away as more people realize and evolve in the methods of remote working in terms of software development, and the practices allow for having anyone anywhere. They already do, but it's just getting used to it. Yeah. And so we do expect to offer talent from elsewhere in the world. The second aspect that we also expect to focus more is, as we are a marketplace that for the most part our priority is to be very talent centric. Mm-hmm. So we try to satisfy the needs of the developer above those of the company. Obviously, we try to satisfy both, but if the one were to take precedence, would be the developer. And as a result of that, we do expect to get into other types of services that the developer needs, both from a professional development, almost like EdTech, and expand on that concept of enabling and helping the developer prepare for the interview. One could think of all the other things that one could prepare for, whether it's learning new technologies or improving on their English skills, etc.
Yeah, career progression.
Correct. And the second aspect is financial services. Unfortunately for these developers, their category of employment and the nature of their work and who they work with and the nature of the relationship, the legal relationship between them and the customer is one that doesn't lend itself very well to the traditional processes of traditional banks and accessing certain financial services, which is ironic given the salary ranges that these developers are able to attract. And so we see there a massive opportunity in terms of delivering products that suit the needs of the developers. And given that we already have a relationship with them, it seems normal that we would be able to grow into that direction as well.
And so, sorry, just you don't mean to pay people for, to facilitate global payments for their work, rather like the actual financial systems that they can't access in their own countries. Correct. Because they're not employed there.
Correct.
Right.
So, and it's the same in the US, right? If you're in the US and you don't have a W-2, which is your labor contract, then you cannot get a mortgage.
I see. Yeah, that's what I thought you meant.
Seems odd.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a thing. Like, I'm also a freelancer and I'm self-employed, and it's definitely harder to prove. You can service a loan, for example.
Correct. Like you have one of the most extreme examples of this is Ben Bernanke, the former chairman of the Fed in the U.S., the one that essentially dealt with the crisis of 2008 and the meltdown of the housing market in the U.S. After his job at the Fed, he published a book and he had more of a quote unquote self-employment life, and couldn't get a mortgage.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of absurd that no matter how much money you make or what type of risk, like job you have, that you're not able to access financial services despite the risk. And for the most part, this is oftentimes when you double click on it and you try to understand why it's happening. Oftentimes it's just that the systems in the local branch of the said bank, the screen doesn't allow you to click, like it doesn't allow you to press next without having a specific field filled up, right?
Yeah.
And so that doesn't feel a good justification for approving or not someone.
Yeah, the systems need to catch up. Well, that's fantastic that you're planning to create a solution there. I think that's a fantastic idea. To wrap up, Pao, what do you think some of the trends are in developer recruitment?
Maybe a cautionary tale or a warning ahead. We think that generally the trend for software development, in particular employment, is going to be one that is going to be quite interesting. We think that the pressure that you currently see in those tech hubs in the US, Silicon Valley, Boston, New York, Seattle, is likely to maybe decompress a little bit as more people start to explore elsewhere. Maybe not, depends on how demand. Like the reality is like there's so much demand that maybe it doesn't even decompress, but at least that pressure expands onto other places. We do expect that will increase salaries everywhere in the world. Like as it reaches some sort of equilibrium between these like spikes in the US and elsewhere being significantly lower, it should like increase the tide everywhere. So it's likely that you will get salaries increases globally for this type of talent. That you are likely as a company, as a local company, you're likely to compete with companies from everywhere else, which is going to make it harder. And you start to see that, like I'm from Spain, and I have friends that have local companies, software companies in Spain, and they started in the recent years to start complaining about Amazon and about Klarna and like every major large company that has landed a foot in Spain. That's likely to kind of go much faster globally and start competing with everyone from anywhere else. And and adapt to that reality and adapt that to the expectations. That if you anchor your expectations for salary, perks, and everything else to what you've seen up until now, well, you're gonna be facing a very, very different reality relatively soon. And that said, I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing for talent to have that type of expertise, to have that type of exposure. And then in the long term, that's going to enable new local companies that have different levels of experience, that have different level of ambition. And it's generally a good thing for the world that all of that intensity from those local tech hubs is actually melting into the rest of the world and spreading out so that more new, better products are created everywhere.
Great. Well, thanks so much for your insights there. And it's been really interesting chatting to you and hearing about Remotely Works. I wish you all the best. And
thank you so much.
Thanks for joining me on The State of Work.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
The State of Work is available wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find us on Instagram or Twitter by searching for The State of Work. For more information about today's topic and links to further reading, check out our show notes at podcast.lano.io. Thanks for listening and see you next time on The State of Work.